Hello there, and welcome back to Real Conflict Zone. I'm your host, and before we dive into tonight's story, I want to thank each and every one of you for being here. Whether you're listening during your morning commute, taking a break from work, or settling in for the night, I appreciate you choosing to spend your time with us. If you're new to the channel, welcome to the community. We explore stories of mystery, the unexplained, and the extraordinary things that happen when reality itself seems to break down. If you find yourself drawn into what you're about to hear, please consider subscribing and hitting that notification bell. And for those of you who've been with us from the beginning, your support means everything. Now, let's get into tonight's story, and I promise you, this one will keep you on the edge of your seat until the very last word. The bus entered the tunnel, but it came out empty. This is the story of Marcus Chen, a night shift bus driver who witnessed something that should be impossible, something that defied every law of physics and logic, something that left investigators baffled and a city gripped by fear. To understand what happened in that tunnel on a cold October night, we need to go back to the beginning, to understand who Marcus was, what he was doing on that route, and why 43 people vanished into thin air while traveling through a tunnel that hundreds of vehicles pass through every single day. Marcus Chen was 37 years old, a former electrical engineer who'd lost his job during the pandemic and had spent the last 3 years driving buses for the Metro Transit Authority. It wasn't the career he'd imagined for himself when he graduated from MIT with honors, but it paid the bills and gave him time to think, to process the divorce that had shattered his carefully planned life, to figure out what he wanted to do with the rest of his existence. He'd chosen the night shift deliberately, preferring the quiet hours between midnight and 6 in the morning when the buses were less crowded, when he could drive through the sleeping city and feel like he had the world to himself. Marcus was methodical, careful, the kind of driver who never got complaints, who followed every regulation, who treated his passengers with professional courtesy, even when they were drunk or belligerent or passed out across the back seats. He'd been driving the number 7 route for 18 months, the same route every night, along the same roads, through the same neighborhoods, into and out of the same tunnel that cut through Mount Harrison and shaved 15 minutes off the journey between the eastern suburbs and downtown. The Mount Harrison Tunnel was 3 miles long, built in the 1960s as part of a massive infrastructure project that had modernized the city's transportation network. It was a straight bore through solid granite, wide enough for 2 lanes of traffic in each direction, lit by sodium vapor lights that cast everything in a sickly orange glow. The tunnel had been renovated 5 years ago, upgraded with modern ventilation systems, new lighting, emergency exits every quarter mile, and a comprehensive camera system that monitored every inch of its length. It was considered one of the safest tunnels in the state, with multiple redundant safety systems and a monitoring station that watched the feeds 24 hours a day. On the night of October 15th, Marcus started his shift at 11:30 p.m., checking in at the depot, doing his pre-drive inspection of Bus 847. A 12-year-old diesel that had seen better days but ran reliably enough. The inspection was routine. Tires, brakes, lights, fluid levels, emergency equipment. Everything checked out normal. Marcus climbed into the driver's seat, adjusted the mirrors, checked the dash cam that recorded everything from the driver's perspective, a requirement after a series of incidents where drivers had been falsely accused of various infractions. The camera was recording, its red light blinking steadily, capturing the empty bus and Marcus's reflection in the rearview mirror. He pulled out of the depot at 11:55 p.m., beginning the first run of the night. The route started in the industrial district on the eastern edge of the city, wound through several neighborhoods, then entered the Mount Harrison Tunnel before emerging downtown. From there, the route continued through the city center and ended at the university campus on the western side. The entire circuit took about 90 minutes, and Marcus would make it 4 times during his shift before the morning drivers took over. The first few stops were quiet, typical for a Thursday night. A janitor getting off work climbed aboard at the first stop, taking a seat near the middle. 2 college students got on at the 3rd stop, laughing about something on one of their phones. A woman in scrubs, probably a nurse finishing a shift, got on at the 5th stop. By the time Marcus reached the last stop before the tunnel, he had 17 passengers scattered throughout the bus, a decent number for this time of night. Marcus pulled away from the stop, checked his mirrors, merged onto the highway that led to the tunnel entrance. The digital clock on his dashboard read 12:47 a.m. Traffic was light, just a few cars and trucks making the overnight journey across the city. The tunnel entrance appeared ahead. A massive concrete portal cut into the side of Mount Harrison, illuminated by floodlights that made the surrounding rock face look almost white against the dark sky. Marcus had driven through this tunnel literally hundreds of times, twice every night, for nights a week for 18 months. He knew every curve, every light fixture, every emergency exit. The tunnel held no mystery for him, no sense of drama or danger. It was just a tunnel, a hole through a mountain, a way to get from point A to point B without having to drive over the mountain or around it. He'd never had any problems in the tunnel, never experienced anything unusual, never even thought about it as anything more than just another segment of his route. But tonight was different. Marcus noticed it immediately as he entered the tunnel, though at first he couldn't quite identify what felt wrong. The lighting seemed dimmer than usual, the orange glow from the sodium vapor lights casting deeper shadows than he remembered. The air that rushed into the bus through the ventilation system felt colder, carrying a smell that Marcus couldn't quite place. Something like ozone mixed with something organic, almost like decay. Marcus shook off the feeling, attributed it to fatigue or imagination. He'd been working 6 nights a week for the past month, covering for a colleague who was out on medical leave, and the exhaustion was probably catching up with him. He focused on the road ahead, maintaining his speed at the posted 45 miles per hour, watching the white lines on the pavement that seemed to stretch endlessly into the orange-lit darkness. In his rearview mirror, Marcus could see his passengers. Most were looking at their phones or staring out the windows at the tunnel walls sliding past. The janitor was dozing, his head resting against the window. The 2 college students were still talking quietly. The nurse was reading something on a tablet. Normal behavior, nothing unusual, just people making a late-night journey across the city. Then Marcus noticed the fog. It started about a mile into the tunnel, a thin mist that seemed to be seeping from the tunnel walls themselves, drifting across the roadway in lazy curls. At first it was barely visible, just a slight haziness in the air that caught the orange light and scattered it. But as Marcus drove deeper into the tunnel, the fog grew thicker, denser, until it was swirling around the bus in waves that seemed almost alive. Marcus frowned, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. There shouldn't be fog in the tunnel. The ventilation system was specifically designed to prevent this kind of thing, to maintain clear air throughout the tunnel's length. And this wasn't normal fog anyway, wasn't the kind of moisture-laden air that formed naturally in certain conditions. This was something else, something that moved wrong, that seemed to have weight and substance beyond what fog should have. He considered stopping, considered using the radio to report the unusual conditions to dispatch. But the tunnel had no shoulder, no place to safely pull over, and stopping in the middle of an active traffic lane would be dangerous. Better to continue through, report it when he emerged on the other side. The tunnel was only 3 miles long. He was already a mile in. 2 more miles and he'd be out in the open air of downtown. Marcus glanced in his rearview mirror again, checking on his passengers. The janitor was still asleep. The college students had stopped talking and were looking out the windows at the fog with expressions of mild curiosity. The nurse had put down her tablet and was also watching the fog swirl past. Several other passengers had noticed it too. Marcus could see them pointing and talking to each other. But no one seemed alarmed, just interested in the unusual phenomenon. The fog continued to thicken. Marcus had to lean forward in his seat, squinting through the windshield, trying to see the road ahead. The white lines were barely visible now, disappearing into the dense fog that seemed to press against the bus from all sides. The orange lights overhead were just dim halos in the mist, providing almost no illumination. Marcus's visibility had dropped to maybe 30 feet, then 20, then less. He eased off the accelerator, bringing the bus's speed down to 35, then 30. This was dangerous, driving half-blind through a tunnel where other vehicles might be traveling at full speed behind him. But he had no choice, couldn't risk hitting something he couldn't see, couldn't risk driving off the road or into a wall. His heart was pounding now, adrenaline sharpening his senses. All his attention focused on the barely visible strip of pavement ahead. That's when he heard the sound. It came from behind him, from the passenger compartment, a sound like static on a radio, a harsh crackling that seemed to fill the entire bus. Marcus glanced in the rearview mirror, and what he saw made his blood run cold. The fog wasn't just outside the bus anymore. It was inside, seeping through the closed windows and doors, pouring through the ventilation vents, filling the passenger compartment with thick white mist that moved with deliberate purpose, like it was hunting for something. The passengers noticed it too. Marcus could see them standing up, moving away from the fog, backing toward the front of the bus. He heard voices, confused and frightened, people calling out to each other, asking what was happening. The college students were at the windows trying to open them, but the windows were the kind that only opened a few inches for safety reasons. The nurse was standing in the aisle, her face pale, her eyes wide. Marcus grabbed the radio, keyed the microphone, called to dispatch. Static answered him. The same harsh crackling he'd heard from the back of the bus, but louder, more intense, drowning out any possibility of communication. He tried again, adjusting frequencies, but every channel was the same. Nothing but static and that underlying sound that seemed almost like voices, like people speaking in a language that existed just outside the range of human hearing. The bus was still moving, still rolling forward through the tunnel, but Marcus could barely see anything now. The fog inside the bus was as thick as the fog outside, and it was getting difficult to breathe, like the air had become heavy and thick. Marcus could taste it, metallic and strange, like licking a battery. His head was beginning to swim, his vision blurring at the edges. In the rearview mirror, through the thick fog that filled the bus, Marcus saw something that made him doubt his sanity. The janitor, the one who'd been sleeping against the window, was gone. Not moved to a different seat, not standing up and walking around. Gone. Vanished. His seat was empty, the window behind it showing nothing but fog. Marcus blinked, shook his head, tried to clear his vision. He must have seen wrong, must have been looking at the wrong seat, must have been confused by the fog and the poor visibility. But then the nurse screamed. It was a sound of pure terror, a shriek that cut through the static and the fog and went straight into Marcus's bones. He tried to turn around, tried to see what was happening, but he had to keep his eyes on the road, had to keep the bus moving, couldn't risk crashing in the middle of the tunnel. In the mirror, he could see the nurse backing away from something, could see her mouth open in another scream that he couldn't hear over the static. And then she was gone too. One moment she was there, backing down the aisle, her hands raised as if to ward off something invisible. The next moment she simply wasn't there anymore, her form dissolving into the fog like she'd been made of smoke herself. Her tablet clattered to the floor, the only evidence she'd ever existed. Marcus's hands were shaking on the steering wheel. His breath was coming in short, sharp gasps. This wasn't possible. People didn't just vanish into thin air. There had to be an explanation, had to be some rational reason for what he was seeing. Maybe the fog was hallucinogenic, maybe he was breathing something that was making him hallucinate, maybe none of this was really happening at all. But it was happening. The college students were gone now too. Marcus hadn't even seen them disappear. They just ceased to exist between one glance in the mirror and the next. Other passengers were running toward the front of the bus, trying to get away from the fog that pursued them, that seemed to reach for them with tendrils of white mist. Marcus could hear them pounding on the door behind him, begging him to stop, to let them out, to save them from whatever was happening. He couldn't stop. There was nowhere to stop, no emergency exit close enough to reach, and even if he stopped, what then? They'd all get out and run where? They were in the middle of a tunnel, a mile from either end, surrounded by fog that seemed capable of swallowing people whole. Their only chance was to keep moving, to get to the other end, to reach open air and safety and the normal world that existed outside this nightmare. Marcus pressed down on the accelerator, pushing the bus faster despite the poor visibility, despite the danger. 40 miles per hour, 45, 50. The fog outside the bus was racing past now, flowing over the windshield like water, and the fog inside the bus was swirling faster, moving with definite purpose, hunting the remaining passengers. In the mirror, Marcus watched as a middle-aged man in a business suit ran down the aisle toward the front. His face twisted in terror. The fog followed him, reached for him, and Marcus saw the man's eyes go wide, saw him open his mouth in a silent scream. Then the fog enveloped him, wrapped around him like a shroud, and when it pulled back, the man was gone. Just gone. His briefcase remained on the floor, his coat draped over a seat, but the man himself had ceased to exist. One by one, the passengers disappeared. An elderly woman with a shopping bag. A teenager with headphones around his neck.
A construcción walker in a hivis vest.
They ran, they hid, they tried to fight the fog with desperate flailing arms, but nothing helped. The fog took them all, methodically, relentlessly, until Marcus was alone behind the wheel of a bus that had carried 17 people into the tunnel but would emerge with only one. Marcus was sobbing now, his vision blurred by tears, his hands locked on the steering wheel in a death grip. He could feel the fog pressing against the driver's compartment, could feel it trying to find a way past the partial barrier that separated him from the passenger area. Cold tendrils of mist were seeping around the edges, reaching for him, and Marcus knew that if he slowed down, if he stopped, if he gave the fog a chance to fully envelop him, he would disappear too. He could see light ahead, faint at first but growing brighter. The end of the tunnel. Marcus aimed for that light like a drowning man swimming toward the surface, pushed the bus as fast as it would go, ignored the screaming of the engine and the smell of burning brake pads. The light grew closer, brighter, and Marcus could see the concrete portal of the tunnel's exit, could see the sodium lights of the downtown streets beyond. The bus burst out of the tunnel like a cork from a bottle, from darkness into the orange-lit night of the city. Marcus slammed on the brakes, bringing the bus to a screeching halt in the middle of the street, not caring about traffic or safety or anything except getting away from that tunnel. He threw the transmission into park, killed the engine, and sat there shaking, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. For a long moment Marcus couldn't move. He sat frozen in the driver's seat, staring at his hands on the wheel, trying to process what had just happened. Then, slowly, he turned around to look at the passenger compartment. The fog was gone. The air was clear. The bus was empty. Every seat vacant. No trace of the 17 people who'd been aboard when he entered the tunnel. Their belongings were still there, scattered throughout the bus. Phones on seats, bags on the floor, a forgotten jacket, a purse, the janitor's lunchbox. But the people themselves had vanished as completely as if they'd never existed. Marcus tried to stand, found his legs wouldn't support him. He collapsed back into the driver's seat, his mind reeling, trying to find some explanation that made sense. Gas leak, hallucination, mental breakdown, anything except the impossible truth that 17 people had disappeared into fog while traveling through a tunnel that thousands of people used every single day. He reached for the radio with shaking hands, found that it was working again. No more static. He keyed the microphone, and when dispatch answered with their routine greeting, Marcus tried to explain what had happened. The words came out jumbled, incoherent, his voice breaking. He heard the confusion in the dispatcher's voice, heard them asking him to slow down, to repeat what he'd said, to clarify whether this was an emergency. It took Marcus 3 tries to make them understand. 17 passengers had disappeared while traveling through the Mount Harrison Tunnel. No, not gotten off at a stop, not left the bus, disappeared, vanished into fog that had filled the bus while they were inside the tunnel. He could hear the skepticism in the dispatcher's voice, could imagine them thinking this was some kind of joke or that Marcus had had some kind of breakdown. But the dispatcher followed protocol, said they were sending police and supervisors to Marcus's location, told him to stay with the bus and wait for assistance. Marcus waited. He sat in the driver's seat of the empty bus, surrounded by the belongings of people who no longer existed, and tried to make sense of the impossible. Other vehicles drove past, their drivers giving the stopped bus curious glances but not stopping. The city continued its late-night rhythm, unconcerned that 17 people had been erased from existence in a tunnel that cut through its heart. The police arrived within 10 minutes, 3 patrol cars with lights flashing. Officers approached the bus cautiously, hands on their weapons, not sure what they were responding to. Marcus opened the door, stepped out on legs that barely held him, tried to explain again what had happened. The officers looked at him like he was drunk or high, but they followed procedure. They searched the bus, found it empty except for the abandoned belongings. They checked Marcus's eyes with flashlights, asked him if he'd been drinking, if he'd taken any medication, if he had any history of mental illness. Marcus submitted to all of it, let them check him, question him, treat him like a suspect. What else could he do? He knew how crazy his story sounded. If someone had told him that 17 people had vanished into fog while riding a bus through a tunnel, he wouldn't have believed it either. But it had happened. He'd seen it happen. And somewhere in that tunnel there was evidence, there had to be evidence, something that would prove he wasn't insane. The transit authority supervisor arrived. A woman named Janet Morrison who'd been Marcus's supervisor for the past 18 months. She knew Marcus, knew he was reliable and professional, not the type to make up stories or have breakdowns. She pulled him aside, away from the police, and asked him quietly what had really happened. Marcus told her everything, watching her face as she processed his words, seeing her skepticism war with her knowledge of his character. Janet made a decision. She called the transit authority's main office, woke up several senior administrators, reported what Marcus had claimed. Then she called the tunnel's monitoring station, asked them to pull the security footage from the tunnel's cameras. If Marcus's story was true, if 17 people had somehow disappeared from a bus while traveling through the tunnel, the cameras would have recorded it. And if the cameras showed nothing, well, that would answer a different set of questions about Marcus's mental state. It took an hour for the footage to be reviewed and transmitted. During that time, Marcus sat in the back of a patrol car, not under arrest but not free to leave either. He watched the police examine the bus, photograph the abandoned belongings, catalog everything they found. He watched other buses from his route drive past, saw his supervisor talking on her phone, saw more police arrive along with investigators from various city departments. When Janet came to the patrol car, her face was pale and her hands were shaking. She asked Marcus to come with her, led him to a police command vehicle that had been set up near the bus. Inside, several people were crowded around a laptop computer, watching something on the screen. They made room for Marcus and Janet hit play on the video. The footage was from the dash cam on bus 847, Marcus's bus. It showed exactly what Marcus had described. The bus entering the tunnel, the initial appearance of the fog, its rapid thickening. The camera's audio picked up the static sound, the confused voices of passengers. And then, clearly visible even through the fog, passengers began to disappear. One moment they were there, the next moment they were gone, their forms dissolving into the mist like they'd been made of smoke. The video showed all of it, recorded in high definition with timestamps and GPS coordinates. 17 people boarding the bus at various stops. 17 people visible in their seats as the bus entered the tunnel. Then, one by one, their disappearance into fog that seemed to move with purpose and intelligence. By the time the bus emerged from the tunnel, the passenger compartment was empty except for their belongings. The people watching the video were silent. Marcus could see the same stunned disbelief on their faces that he'd felt in the tunnel. This wasn't possible. This violated every law of physics and logic. But it had happened, and it was recorded on video, and now dozens of people were witnesses to something that should not exist. One of the investigators, a man who identified himself as Detective Raymond Walsh from the city's major crimes unit, turned to Marcus and asked the only question that mattered. Is there any chance this video has been tampered with or altered in any way? Marcus shook his head. The dash cam system was designed to prevent tampering, recorded directly to a secure server with timestamps and encryption. The video was authentic, which meant that, impossible or not, 17 people had vanished from his bus while traveling through the Mount Harrison tunnel. Detective Walsh made several phone calls. Within 20 minutes, the tunnel was closed to all traffic, police blockades set up at both ends. A search team was assembled, dozens of officers who would walk through the tunnel from end to end, looking for any sign of the missing passengers. Simultaneously, investigators began the process of identifying the missing people, using the belongings left on the bus, pulling security footage from the bus stops where they'd boarded, beginning the terrible process of notifying families that their loved ones had disappeared in circumstances that defied explanation. Marcus was taken to the police station, not as a suspect but as a witness. He spent the next 8 hours being interviewed by multiple detectives, federal agents who arrived from some alphabet agency Marcus didn't recognize, and eventually a team of specialists who asked him detailed questions about the fog, about how it moved, about what he'd felt and smelled and experienced. They showed him photographs and asked him if the fog had looked like this or that, if it had behaved like natural fog or something else. Through it all, Marcus told the truth as he remembered it. He described the fog's appearance, its unnatural movement, the way it had seemed to hunt the passengers. He described the sound, the static mixed with something that might have been voices. He described the cold, metallic taste in the air, the way his head had felt swimmy and strange. He left out nothing, knowing that every detail might be important, might help someone understand what had happened and why. As dawn broke over the city, Marcus was finally allowed to leave. Janet drove him home, neither of them speaking during the ride. What was there to say? 17 people were gone, vanished into fog in a tunnel that should have been safe, and the only survivor was a night shift bus driver whose life would never be the same. The search team found nothing in the tunnel. They walked every inch of its 3-mile length, shined lights into every crevice and emergency exit, checked every ventilation shaft and maintenance access. There was no trace of the missing passengers. No bodies, no clothing, no signs of struggle or violence. Nothing except a faint smell that some of the searchers reported, something like ozone mixed with decay, though it faded quickly and couldn't be detected by the air quality monitors that were brought in to analyze the tunnel's atmosphere. The tunnel's security cameras showed the same thing as the bus's dash cam. The fog appearing, thickening, and then the bus emerging with its passenger compartment empty. But the tunnel's cameras also showed something the dash cam hadn't captured. Several minutes before Marcus's bus entered the tunnel, the lights had flickered, dimmed significantly, then returned to normal. The monitoring station had logged it as a power fluctuation, nothing unusual for a system that old, not worth investigating. But now it seemed significant, seemed like maybe it had been a warning of what was coming. The news broke that morning, and within hours the story had gone national, then international. 17 people vanishing from a bus in a tunnel was the kind of mystery that captured public imagination, especially when there was video evidence that couldn't be disputed. News crews descended on the city, set up outside the tunnel entrances, interviewed anyone who would talk to them. The missing passengers' families held tearful press conferences, pleading for information, for answers, for anything that would explain what had happened to their loved ones. Marcus became the center of unwanted attention. Reporters camped outside his apartment, called his phone at all hours, offered him money for exclusive interviews. He refused them all, stayed inside with the curtains drawn, trying to process what he'd experienced. The transit authority put him on paid administrative leave, not as punishment but because he clearly wasn't in any condition to work. A counselor was provided, someone who specialized in trauma, though how do you counsel someone who's experienced something that shouldn't be possible? The theories started immediately. Some claimed it was a government experiment gone wrong, that the fog had been some kind of chemical weapon being tested in the tunnel. Others said it was alien abduction, that the fog had been a transport mechanism for extraterrestrials collecting human specimens. Religious groups claimed it was the rapture, that the disappeared passengers had been taken to heaven while Marcus, as an unbeliever, had been left behind. Conspiracy theorists constructed elaborate explanations involving parallel dimensions, time travel, government cover-ups, and secret technologies. But the official investigation found nothing to support any of these theories. The air in the tunnel tested normal for all known chemicals and biological agents. Radiation levels were background normal. There was no evidence of any unusual electromagnetic activity. The tunnel structure showed no signs of stress or damage. By every measurable metric, the Mount Harrison tunnel was exactly what it appeared to be. A hole through a mountain, nothing more. The families of the missing passengers hired private investigators, offered rewards for information, organized search parties that combed the areas around both tunnel entrances. Psychics and mediums contacted the police, claiming they could locate the missing people through supernatural means. None of it led anywhere. The 17 passengers remained missing, their fate unknown, their disappearance a mystery that defied every attempt at explanation. 3 weeks after the incident, Detective Walsh came to Marcus's apartment for what he said would be their final interview. The official investigation was being closed due to lack of evidence. The missing passengers would be declared legally dead after the appropriate waiting period. The tunnel would be reopened to traffic after extensive safety inspections confirmed there were no structural or mechanical issues that could have contributed to the incident. Life would go on, except for the families of the disappeared and for Marcus, whose life had been irrevocably changed by 10 minutes in a fog-filled tunnel. Walsh asked Marcus if there was anything else he remembered, anything he might have forgotten to mention in previous interviews. Marcus thought about it, closed his eyes, tried to put himself back in that driver's seat, traveling through the fog. And then he remembered something that had been buried beneath all the horror and fear and confusion. Just before the fog had appeared, Marcus had seen something in the tunnel ahead. It had been quick, just a momentary glimpse of movement near the right wall, maybe a quarter mile into the tunnel. At the time, he dismissed it as a trick of the light or a maintenance worker in one of the emergency exits. But thinking back on it now, Marcus realized it had been something else. A figure, tall and dark, standing in one of the alcoves that held emergency equipment. It had been there for just a second, visible in his headlights, and then it was gone, and then the fog had appeared. Walsh took notes, asked detailed questions about what Marcus had seen. Height, build, clothing, any distinguishing features. But Marcus couldn't provide much detail. It had been too quick, too far away, and he'd been focused on driving. Just an impression of something tall and dark, standing where nothing should have been standing, watching the bus approach. Walsh thanked Marcus for his time, gave him a card with a direct phone number, told him to call if he remembered anything else. Then he left, and Marcus was alone again in his apartment, sitting in the dim light of afternoon, thinking about fog and vanished passengers and a dark figure in a tunnel. The tunnel reopened 4 weeks after the incident. There was a big ceremony, the mayor cutting a ribbon, officials giving speeches about safety and the importance of not giving in to fear. The first vehicles to drive through were police cars and city vehicles, officials wanting to demonstrate that the tunnel was safe. And it was safe. No fog appeared. No one disappeared. The tunnel was just a tunnel again. But traffic remained light for weeks afterward. People took alternate routes, drove over the mountain or around it, added time to their journeys rather than risk driving through the tunnel where 17 people had vanished. The number 7 bus route was rerouted to avoid the tunnel entirely, taking a longer path that added 25 minutes to each trip. The transit authority didn't say it was because of the incident, claimed it was due to route optimization, but everyone knew the real reason. Marcus didn't go back to driving buses. The transit authority offered him other positions, office work or maintenance, anything to keep him employed. But Marcus couldn't do it, couldn't be part of that world anymore, couldn't put on the uniform and pretend everything was normal when 17 people had disappeared on his watch. He resigned, took the small settlement the transit authority offered to avoid a lawsuit, and tried to figure out what to do with the rest of his life. For months, Marcus barely left his apartment. He lived on his savings and the settlement, ordered food delivery, ignored calls from friends and former colleagues. He watched the news obsessively, looking for any update about the missing passengers, any new theory or explanation. But as time passed, the story faded from the headlines, replaced by newer mysteries and tragedies. The world moved on. The families mourned. And Marcus was left alone with his memories and his questions. It was 6 months after the incident when Marcus decided he needed to go back to the tunnel. Not to drive through it, but to walk through it, to see if he could find anything the official searches had missed, to see if being in that space again would trigger some memory or understanding of what had happened. It was stupid, probably dangerous, definitely against several laws. But Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that there were answers in that tunnel, that something was there waiting to be found. He went at night, parking his car near the eastern entrance around 2 in the morning when traffic was lightest. The tunnel was open to vehicles, but pedestrians weren't allowed, a rule that had been enforced more strictly since the incident. But the pedestrian entrances weren't particularly secure, just chain-link gates. That could be climbed by someone determined enough. Marcus climbed the gate, dropped down on the other side, and started walking into the tunnel. He had a flashlight, though he didn't really need it. The sodium vapor lights were on, casting their familiar orange glow over everything. His footsteps echoed off the concrete walls, the sound lonely and strange. Behind him, he could hear the occasional vehicle driving through, but they were few and far between at this hour. He walked slowly, paying attention to everything. The emergency exits every quarter mile, their steel doors closed and locked. The ventilation shafts high on the walls, still humming with the air circulation system. The cameras mounted on the ceiling, their red lights blinking to show they were recording. Everything looked normal, just like it had on hundreds of previous trips through this tunnel. About a mile in, roughly the point where the fog had first appeared, Marcus stopped. He closed his eyes, tried to remember what he'd felt that night. The cold air, the metallic taste, the sound of static. But there was nothing now, just the normal tunnel sounds and smells. If something had happened here, it had left no trace he could detect. Marcus continued walking, deeper into the tunnel. He was past the midpoint now, in the section where most of the passengers had disappeared. He found himself looking for signs of them, for any evidence they'd been here. A button from someone's coat, a dropped earring, anything. But there was nothing. The tunnel had been cleaned and maintained. Any debris that might have been left behind had been swept away. He was nearly 2 miles in when he heard something. A sound like static, faint at first but growing louder. Marcus froze, his heart suddenly pounding. The sound was coming from ahead, from deeper in the tunnel. It was the same sound he'd heard that night, the harsh crackling mixed with something that might have been voices. Marcus turned around, started walking back the way he'd come. Faster now. The sound followed him, growing louder, echoing off the tunnel walls. He could feel the air growing colder, could taste that metallic flavor on his tongue. This was wrong. He shouldn't have come here, shouldn't have tempted fate by returning to the place where impossible things happened. He broke into a run, his footsteps echoing wildly, his breath coming in gasps. Behind him, the static was getting louder, and beneath it he could definitely hear voices now, multiple voices speaking in unison, saying something he couldn't quite make out. The tunnel lights flickered, dimmed, and Marcus ran faster, not looking back, focused only on the exit he could see ahead. And then he saw the fog. It was seeping from the walls ahead of him, cutting off his path to the exit. The same thick white mist that had filled his bus 6 months ago. Marcus skidded to a stop, nearly fell, caught himself against the tunnel wall. He was trapped between the fog ahead and the sound behind, and he realized with horrible clarity that whatever had taken his passengers had been waiting for him to return, had known he would come back, had been patient. The fog ahead of him swirled and condensed, forming shapes that might have been human but weren't quite right, proportions subtly off, movements too smooth and flowing. Marcus backed away from these shapes, found himself pressed against the tunnel wall, nowhere left to run. The static behind him was deafening now, and when he turned to look, he saw a darkness there, a shadow deeper than the tunnel's ordinary darkness, moving toward him with terrible purpose. Marcus did the only thing he could think of. He ran to one of the emergency exits, grabbed the door handle, and pulled. The door was supposed to be locked, only openable from inside by someone with a key. But it swung open easily, as if it had been waiting for him, and Marcus plunged through it into darkness beyond. The emergency exit led to a maintenance tunnel, narrow and unlit except for dim emergency lighting. Marcus ran down it, not knowing where it led, just knowing he had to get away from the fog and the darkness and the static voices. Behind him, he could hear something following, could hear the scrape of movement on concrete, could feel cold air rushing past him like breath. The maintenance tunnel branched, split into multiple directions. Marcus chose randomly, took the left path, kept running. His lungs were burning, his legs cramping, but he didn't dare stop. The sound of pursuit was constant behind him, sometimes closer, sometimes farther, but never going away entirely. He ran for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, through tunnels that twisted and branched like a labyrinth, past locked doors and darkened alcoves and pipes that dripped water onto the concrete floor. And then, suddenly, he burst through a door and found himself on a city street, emerging from some kind of maintenance access he hadn't even known existed. Marcus collapsed on the sidewalk, gasping for breath, his body shaking. He was somewhere downtown, several blocks from the tunnel's main exit, in an area he didn't immediately recognize. Traffic passed by, early morning commuters heading to work, people walking their dogs, the normal life of the city flowing around him like he hadn't just escaped from something impossible. He pulled out his phone with shaking hands, called Detective Walsh's direct number. The detective answered on the third ring, sounded annoyed at being called so early, but his tone changed when he heard Marcus's voice. Marcus told him everything about going to the tunnel, about the fog returning, about what he'd seen and heard. Walsh was silent for a long moment, then told Marcus to stay where he was, that he was sending a patrol car to pick him up. The police found Marcus sitting on the sidewalk, still shaking, unable to stand. They took him to the hospital, ran tests, checked for drugs or alcohol or any medical condition that might explain his state. But there was nothing. Marcus was physically fine, just exhausted and scared. Walsh arrived at the hospital, listened as Marcus told his story again, asked careful questions about what Marcus had seen and heard. Then Walsh told Marcus something that made his blood run cold. There had been other incidents in the tunnel, reports that had been kept quiet to avoid public panic. Several drivers had reported seeing fog in the tunnel late at night, though it had always dissipated before they could report it officially. 2 people had claimed to see figures standing in the emergency alcoves, though security camera footage showed nothing. And most disturbing, 3 people had gone missing after being seen entering the tunnel on foot, though that had been attributed to suicide or people running away from their lives. Walsh said the city was considering closing the tunnel permanently, that there were discussions happening at levels of government Marcus couldn't imagine. But there were complications. The tunnel was critical infrastructure, closing it would cause massive traffic problems, and without concrete evidence of a danger that could be explained and understood, it was hard to justify the economic impact. Marcus listened to all of this and realized that the city was trapped in its own kind of fog, unable to see clearly, unable to make decisions because the truth was too strange to accept. 17 people had vanished, others had reported strange experiences, and a bus driver had nearly been taken by something that shouldn't exist. But because none of it fit into the normal framework of reality, it was being minimized, explained away, treated as a mystery rather than an active threat. Marcus made a decision then. He couldn't let this continue, couldn't let more people be put at risk because officials didn't want to accept an impossible truth. He told Walsh he wanted to go public with everything, wanted to tell his story to the media, wanted to warn people about the dangers in that tunnel. Walsh tried to talk him out of it, said it would cause panic, would make Marcus a target for skeptics and conspiracy theorists. But Marcus's mind was made up. The interview aired on national television 2 days later. Marcus sat across from a sympathetic journalist and told everything. The initial disappearances, his return to the tunnel, what he'd seen and experienced. He showed documents, played audio recordings, presented evidence that was impossible to dispute. And at the end of the interview, he looked directly into the camera and said that no one should use the Mount Harrison tunnel, that something was wrong in that space, that the 17 missing passengers were just the beginning if nothing was done. The reaction was immediate and intense. The city was forced to respond, held a press conference where officials tried to downplay Marcus's claims, while also announcing that the tunnel would be closed for extensive safety inspections. Traffic was rerouted, the number 7 bus route was permanently changed, and teams of engineers and scientists were brought in to examine every inch of the tunnel's structure. They found nothing. Or more accurately, they found things they couldn't explain. Unusual electromagnetic readings that appeared and disappeared with no pattern. Areas where the temperature was consistently colder than it should be. Spots on the tunnel walls where the concrete seemed somehow different. Analyzed under microscopes to reveal a molecular structure that didn't quite match the rest of the tunnel. But nothing that could explain the disappearances, nothing that provided a clear answer. The tunnel remained closed for 3 months. During that time, Marcus became something of a reluctant celebrity, appearing on talk shows and podcasts, always telling the same story, always warning people that there were things in the world that couldn't be explained by conventional science. Some people believed him, called him brave for speaking out. Others called him delusional. claimed he was seeking attention or had suffered a mental breakdown. Marcus didn't care about any of it. He just wanted people to be safe. During those 3 months, researchers from various universities and institutions asked if they could study the tunnel. Paranormal investigators showed up with equipment designed to detect ghosts or demons or whatever they thought might be responsible. Government agencies Marcus had never heard of conducted tests and measurements. And through it all, the tunnel sat silent and empty, its secrets unchanged, its darkness waiting. The decision to reopen the tunnel came from political pressure and economic necessity. The traffic disruption was costing the city millions of dollars, affecting everything from delivery times to commute patterns. Engineers had installed new monitoring systems, more cameras, sensors that would detect any change in atmospheric conditions or electromagnetic activity. There would be increased police patrols, emergency response teams on standby, a whole infrastructure designed to catch any recurrence of the phenomenon that had taken 17 people. The tunnel reopened on a Monday morning with minimal ceremony. Traffic immediately returned to normal levels, people either having forgotten the danger or deciding that convenience was worth the risk. The number 7 bus route remained rerouted, but other buses began using the tunnel again. And for weeks, nothing happened. The fog didn't return. No one disappeared. The tunnel was just a tunnel again, and people began to think that maybe Marcus had been wrong. Maybe it had been a one-time phenomenon, maybe the danger had passed. Marcus knew better. He could feel it, some instinct that told him the tunnel wasn't safe, that whatever had caused the disappearances was still there, just waiting. He spent his days monitoring news reports, checking social media for any mention of unusual experiences in the tunnel. And he found them if he looked carefully enough. Drivers reporting seeing fog that their passengers couldn't see. People feeling suddenly cold when driving through certain sections. One woman who swore she'd heard voices speaking from her car's speakers while passing through the tunnel, though the investigation showed nothing wrong with her vehicle. It was 4 months after the tunnel reopened when it happened again. This time it wasn't a bus but a passenger car, a sedan with a family of 4 heading home after visiting relatives. The father was driving, the mother in the passenger seat, 2 children in the back. They entered the tunnel at 11 p.m., and they never came out the other side. The car was found the next morning by tunnel maintenance workers, stopped in the middle of the right lane about halfway through the tunnel. The engine was still running, the headlights on, the doors locked from the inside. But the car was empty. The father, mother, and 2 children were gone. Their belongings were still in the vehicle, the mother's purse on the floor, the children's tablets on the back seat, the father's phone in the cup holder. But the family themselves had vanished as completely as the bus passengers had 6 months earlier. The security cameras told the same story as before. The car entering the tunnel normally. Fog appearing, thick and unnatural, filling the tunnel and enveloping the car. Then the fog dissipating, and the car still rolling forward on momentum before coming to a stop, its interior empty. For more people gone, swallowed by something that shouldn't exist. This time the response was immediate and decisive. The tunnel was closed, this time with no plans to reopen it. Armed guards were posted at both entrances. Engineers began the process of sealing the tunnel permanently, filling it with concrete and steel, entombing whatever was inside. There were no more press conferences claiming everything was safe, no more assurances that it had been a one-time anomaly. The city had finally accepted that the Mount Harrison Tunnel was dangerous in ways that couldn't be explained or mitigated. Marcus heard about the second incident on the news and felt a mixture of vindication and horror. He'd been right about the danger, but being right meant that 4 more people were gone, 4 more families were destroyed. He wondered if he could have done more, if he should have been more forceful in his warnings, if he could have prevented this somehow. But he knew that wasn't fair to himself. He'd done everything he could. The city had made its choices and people had made theirs, and now everyone had to live with the consequences. The families of all 21 missing people, the original 17 bus passengers plus the family of 4, filed lawsuits against the city, the transit authority, and various other entities. The cases would take years to resolve, but everyone knew the city would eventually settle for substantial sums. No amount of money could bring back the missing, but it was the only form of justice available when the crime itself defied all understanding. As the tunnel was being sealed, a team of scientists asked for permission to conduct one final study. They wanted to spend 72 hours inside the tunnel, fully monitored and equipped with every sensor and recording device available, to try to capture whatever phenomenon was responsible for the disappearances. The city approved the request, partly because the scientists were well-credentialed and partly because officials hoped that some explanation might reduce the city's liability in the lawsuits. The team consisted of 6 people, 3 physicists specializing in quantum mechanics, a geologist, a parapsychologist, and a medical doctor. They entered the tunnel at noon on a Wednesday, surrounded by enough monitoring equipment to fill 2 trucks. Every conceivable measurement would be taken: electromagnetic fields, radiation, temperature, air pressure, gravitational variations, even exotic things like torsion fields and zero-point energy fluctuations. They had cameras covering every angle, audio recorders capturing every sound, sensors that would detect the presence of any known substance or energy. Marcus watched this on the news and felt a deep unease. These were smart people, careful people, but they didn't understand what they were dealing with. The tunnel didn't follow the rules of normal physics, didn't respond to conventional scientific inquiry. Going in there, even with all their equipment and precautions, was like stepping into the territory of something that existed outside human understanding. But he also understood their motivation. Scientists needed to question, to investigate, to seek answers. It was their nature, even when that nature led them into danger. The first day passed without incident. The team set up their equipment, took baseline readings, documented everything with meticulous care. They reported back every hour to a command center that had been established outside the tunnel entrance. All measurements were normal, nothing unusual detected. The tunnel was behaving like any other tunnel. On the second day, things began to change. The team reported strange electromagnetic fluctuations, brief but intense, appearing and disappearing with no apparent pattern. Temperature in certain areas of the tunnel dropped by 10 degrees for no reason, then returned to normal. One of the cameras malfunctioned, showing static for several seconds before recovering. But nothing threatening, nothing that suggested immediate danger. It was on the third day, about 60 hours into the study, when the team lost contact with the command center. The hourly check-in didn't happen. Attempts to reach them by radio got only static in response. The command center waited the mandated 30 minutes, then sent in a rescue team wearing full protective gear and carrying weapons, not sure what they were responding to but preparing for the worst. The rescue team found the scientists' equipment scattered throughout the tunnel, still running, still recording. But the scientists themselves were gone. All 6 of them had vanished, just like the bus passengers, just like the family in the car. The only difference was that this time, they'd left behind extensive documentation of what happened. The recordings told a disturbing story. On the final day, the fog had appeared, seeping from the walls just as it had during the previous incidents. The team had been excited at first, thinking they were finally witnessing the phenomenon they'd come to study. They'd gathered around their instruments, taking readings, documenting everything. The lead physicist was narrating into a voice recorder, describing the fog's appearance and behavior in clinical detail. Then the static had started, and the voices beneath it. The team's excitement had turned to concern, then to fear. On the video recordings, they could be seen backing away from the fog, which was moving toward them with deliberate purpose. The parapsychologist had started saying something about the fog not being fog at all, about it being something else entirely, but his words were cut off by the static. The last clear image from the cameras showed the 6 scientists huddled together in the center of the tunnel, completely surrounded by fog. They were holding hands, whether for comfort or in some attempt to stay together, it wasn't clear. And then, one by one, they disappeared. The cameras captured it all, recorded the moment when each person simply ceased to exist, their form dissolving into the fog like they'd been absorbed by it. The final camera to fail showed something that would haunt everyone who saw the footage. In the fog, just before the camera went dark, shapes were visible. Human-shaped but wrong, too tall, proportions off, moving in ways that human bodies shouldn't move. And they were reaching toward the remaining scientists. Form? Marcus wanted to give her comfort, wanted to tell her that her grandson hadn't suffered, that maybe the disappeared were in some better place. But he couldn't lie to her, couldn't offer false hope. He told her honestly that he didn't know what had happened to the passengers after they disappeared. He'd seen them vanish into fog, seen them cease to exist in this reality. But what that meant for their consciousness, their souls, their existence beyond the physical, he simply couldn't say. The grandmother nodded, seemed to appreciate his honesty even if it wasn't the answer she'd hoped for. She told Marcus that not knowing was the hardest part, that she could have accepted her grandson's death if there had been a body, a funeral, the normal rituals of grief and closure. But this uncertainty, this not knowing whether to mourn or hope, was a special kind of torture that none of the families could escape. Marcus understood. He carried his own uncertainty, his own questions about what he'd witnessed. In quiet moments, usually late at night when sleep wouldn't come, he found himself wondering if the passengers were truly gone or if they existed somewhere else, in some space adjacent to reality where the fog had taken them. He wondered if they were aware, if they suffered, if they remembered their lives before the tunnel. He wondered if someday he might join them, if whatever had been hunting him that night when he'd returned to the tunnel might someday catch him. The years passed slowly. Marcus moved to a different city, started a new job as a technical writer for a software company, tried to build a life that wasn't defined by those 10 minutes in a fog-filled tunnel. He dated occasionally, though relationships never lasted long. How do you explain to someone that you're haunted by the memory of 17 people vanishing while you could only watch? How do you come back from witnessing something that shouldn't exist? Marcus carried that weight alone, kept his past mostly hidden, became someone else who happened to share his name and face. But he never forgot. Every October 15th, the anniversary of the incident, Marcus would take the day off work and spend it researching. He maintained a database of similar incidents, corresponded with researchers and investigators, followed up on every lead and theory. He became an amateur expert on unexplained disappearances, on locations where reality seemed to behave strangely, on the thin places where the normal world intersected with something else. What he found was both fascinating and terrifying. The Mount Harrison Tunnel wasn't unique. Throughout history and across the world, there were places where people vanished in circumstances that defied explanation. The Bermuda Triangle was famous, but there were dozens of other locations with similar reputations. Certain forests where hikers disappeared without trace. Urban areas where people entered buildings and were never seen again. Even specific rooms in specific houses where multiple residents had vanished over the years. Most of these cases were dismissed as coincidence or explained away with conventional theories. People got lost, ran away, were victims of foul play, fell into holes or water and were never recovered. But in some cases, the similarities to the tunnel incident were too strong to ignore. The fog, the static sounds, the sense of something watching and hunting, the complete disappearance of victims leaving only their belongings behind. Whatever had taken Marcus's passengers wasn't unique to that tunnel. It existed in other places, took other victims, operated according to rules that humans hadn't yet discovered. Marcus began to develop a theory. He didn't know if it was correct, but it was the only explanation that fit all the facts he'd gathered. He theorized that there were locations in the world where the barrier between our reality and something else, some other dimension or plane of existence, was thin or damaged. In these places, under certain conditions, the barrier could be breached, allowing things to pass from one side to the other. The fog wasn't really fog, it was something from the other side, a manifestation of whatever existed in that adjacent space. And when it took people, it wasn't killing them, it was pulling them through the barrier into that other place. What existed in that other place, Marcus couldn't even guess. Was it another physical realm just different from ours? Was it some kind of non-physical existence, a dimension of pure consciousness or energy? Were the people who'd been taken still themselves, or had they been transformed into something else? Marcus had no answers, only questions that multiplied the more he researched. 10 years after the incident, Marcus was contacted by a physicist named Dr. Elena Vasquez who'd seen the documentary and had been studying similar phenomena. Dr. Vasquez had a theory about quantum entanglement and parallel universes that she thought might explain the tunnel disappearances. She wanted to meet with Marcus, to interview him in detail, to see if his experiences matched her theoretical framework. They met in a coffee shop in the city where Marcus now lived. Dr. Vasquez was younger than Marcus expected, maybe 40, with intense eyes and an energy that suggested she'd dedicated her life to solving this particular mystery. She explained her theory in language Marcus struggled to follow, involving quantum superposition and many worlds interpretation and probability wave collapse. But the essence of her theory was this. She believed the tunnel existed in a state of quantum uncertainty, simultaneously present in multiple realities. Under certain conditions, that uncertainty could resolve in a way that moved people from one reality branch to another, making them disappear from our perspective while they continued to exist in another timeline or dimension. Marcus listened to all of this and felt a strange mixture of hope and skepticism. Hope because if Dr. Vasquez was right, it meant the disappeared passengers weren't dead. They were just elsewhere, living their lives in some alternate version of reality. Skepticism because the theory, while elegant, couldn't be tested or proven, at least not with current technology. And even if it was true, it didn't offer any way to bring the disappeared people back or to prevent future incidents. Dr. Vasquez acknowledged these limitations but insisted that understanding the phenomenon was the first step toward controlling it. If they could figure out what conditions triggered the quantum uncertainty in places like the Mount Harrison Tunnel, they might be able to predict when and where incidents would occur, warn people away, maybe even develop technology to stabilize these locations and prevent the crossover between realities. Marcus wanted to believe her. He wanted to think that his suffering and the family's grief might lead to some breakthrough that would make sense of the impossible. But he'd spent 10 years looking for answers and had found only more questions. The universe seemed determined to remain mysterious, to keep its secrets, to remind humans that for all their science and technology, there were things they simply couldn't understand. Still, Marcus agreed to work with Dr. Vasquez. He gave her detailed accounts of everything he'd experienced, answered every question she had, provided her with copies of all his research and documentation. If there was even a small chance that his information might lead to a breakthrough, it was worth the time and emotional energy it cost him to relive those memories. Dr. Vasquez used Marcus's information to build a comprehensive database of similar incidents. She identified patterns that Marcus had missed, correlations between incidents and factors like geological formations, electromagnetic anomalies, and even astronomical events. She developed a predictive model that could identify locations where incidents were most likely to occur. It wasn't perfect, but it was something, a step toward understanding rather than just fear. The model predicted that the next high-probability incident would occur in a tunnel in Japan, a long underwater tunnel connecting two islands. Dr. Vasquez contacted authorities there, warned them about the potential danger, showed them her research and predictive model. The authorities were polite but skeptical, as Marcus had expected. Without concrete proof, it was hard to convince anyone to take expensive protective measures based on a theory about quantum mechanics and parallel universes. But Dr. Vasquez persisted. She managed to convince the authorities to at least install additional monitoring equipment in the tunnel, sensors that would detect the kinds of electromagnetic and temperature anomalies that had preceded incidents in the Mount Harrison Tunnel and similar locations. If nothing else, they'd have early warning if something strange started happening. 3 months after the equipment was installed, the predictions proved accurate. Late one night, the sensors detected unusual readings in the Japanese tunnel. Fog began forming inside the tunnel, despite the ventilation systems operating normally. The authorities, taking Dr. Vasquez's warnings seriously this time, immediately closed the tunnel and evacuated the few vehicles that were inside. Within minutes, the fog had thickened to the point where security cameras could barely penetrate it. Strange sounds were reported by maintenance workers near the tunnel entrances. Static mixed with voices speaking in languages no one recognized. The fog persisted for 3 hours, then dissipated as suddenly as it had appeared. When investigators entered the tunnel afterward, they found it empty and undamaged. But the incident had been real, had been detected by multiple systems and witnessed by multiple people. And because the tunnel had been evacuated in time, no one had disappeared. Dr. Vasquez's team monitored the construction constantly, looking for signs of the electromagnetic anomalies that seemed to precede displacement events. They found occasional spikes, but nothing sustained, nothing that suggested immediate danger. The new tunnel opened 25 years after the original incident. There was a subdued ceremony, no celebration but an acknowledgement that the city had overcome tragedy and learned from it. Marcus was there, along with family members of some of the disappeared passengers. It was a bittersweet moment, seeing this new tunnel that existed because the old one had failed so catastrophically, that incorporated so much knowledge purchased with 27 lives. Traffic through the new tunnel built slowly. People were cautious, remembered the stories, took alternate routes if they had time. But gradually confidence grew. The monitoring systems showed normal readings. No fog appeared. No one disappeared. The new tunnel seemed to be just a tunnel, a hole through a mountain, nothing more. Marcus drove through the new tunnel once, needing to confront that fear directly. His wife came with him for support, held his hand as they entered the portal and drove into the artificially lit passage. Marcus felt his heart racing, his palms sweating, every instinct screaming at him to turn around. But he continued, focused on the road ahead, on the end of the tunnel visible in the distance. 3 miles passed slowly, every second an eternity, and then they emerged into sunlight on the other side, both of them exhaling in relief. Nothing had happened. The tunnel was safe, or at least it seemed safe. Marcus knew better than to assume safety was guaranteed. Dr. Vasquez's research had shown that the displacement phenomena were unpredictable, could occur even in places that had been previously safe. But the odds were low. The new tunnel had been designed with every precaution, and sometimes you had to accept a small amount of risk to live a normal life. 30 years after the incident, Marcus was in his late 60s, retired from his technical writing job, spending his time with his family and continuing his consulting work with Dr. Vasquez's team. The field of quantum displacement studies had grown substantially, was now a legitimate area of scientific inquiry with research happening at major universities around the world. Multiple incidents had been predicted and prevented, lives had been saved, and humanity's understanding of reality had expanded in ways that would have seemed like science fiction just a few decades earlier. The disappeared passengers from the Mount Harrison Tunnel had been legally declared dead decades ago. Their families had mourned, moved on as best they could, though the uncertainty never fully left them. Occasionally Marcus still heard from family members, usually on the anniversary of the disappearances, sometimes just wanting to talk to someone who understood, who'd been there, who carried the same questions they did. Marcus always made time for these conversations. He felt he owed it to the disappeared, to be a witness to their existence, to remember them when the world had mostly forgotten. 17 people had been on his bus that night, and while he hadn't been able to save them, he could at least honor their memory, keep their stories alive, ensure they weren't erased by time and the world's short attention span. One evening, sitting on his porch watching the sunset, Marcus received a call from Dr. Vasquez. She sounded excited, said she had something to show him, something that might finally provide answers to the questions he'd been asking for 3 decades. Marcus felt a mixture of anticipation and dread. After all this time, did he really want answers? Had he made peace with the mystery, or would new information reopen old wounds? Dr. Vasquez arrived the next day with several members of her research team. They set up a laptop in Marcus's living room, explained that they developed new scanning technology that could detect quantum signatures in places where displacement events had occurred. They'd scanned the site of the original Mount Harrison Tunnel, even though it was sealed with concrete, and what they'd found was remarkable. The scans showed persistent quantum entanglement in the tunnel's location, a signature that suggested the barrier between realities was still damaged, still potentially crossable. But more than that, they detected what might be echoes, quantum imprints left behind by the people who'd disappeared. It wasn't proof that the disappeared were alive, but it suggested their existence had left a permanent mark on this reality, that they hadn't been completely erased. Dr. Vasquez showed Marcus the data, pointing to specific signatures that corresponded to the number of disappeared people, to the times and locations of the disappearances. It was all highly technical, but the implication was clear. The disappeared passengers might still exist somewhere, in some form, in the reality or dimension they'd been pulled into. And if they existed, if their quantum signatures were still detectable, then theoretically they might be retrievable. Marcus absorbed this information slowly, trying to understand what it meant. For 30 years he'd assumed the passengers were dead, gone forever, their disappearance an irreversible tragedy. But if Dr. Vasquez was right, if there was even a possibility of bringing them back, everything changed. The question wasn't whether to mourn anymore, it was whether to hope, whether to pursue the possibility of rescue even if it meant reopening the tunnel, confronting the phenomenon that had taken them, risking more lives in an attempt to save those already lost. Dr. Vasquez explained that her team was proposing an experimental mission. They wanted to drill a small access shaft into the original tunnel, install equipment to stabilize the quantum entanglement, and then send in a team to attempt contact with the other side. It was dangerous, possibly futile, but it was the first time in 30 years that they'd had any possibility of learning what happened to the disappeared passengers or potentially bringing them back. Marcus listened to the proposal and felt all his carefully constructed peace crumbling. For 30 years he'd been healing, moving forward, building a life despite the trauma. And now he was being asked to go back, to confront the tunnel again, to risk everything in pursuit of answers that might not even exist. It would be easier to say no, to let the past stay buried, to protect the life he'd built. But Marcus couldn't do it. He couldn't abandon the 17 people who'd been his passengers, couldn't ignore the possibility, however slim, that they might still be retrievable. He told Dr. Vasquez he would support the mission, would consult on it, would do whatever was necessary. And if they needed someone to go into the tunnel, someone who'd experienced the phenomenon and survived it, he would volunteer for that too. Sarah, Marcus's wife, protested. She understood his motivations but didn't want him to risk his life, didn't want their daughter to lose her father in pursuit of people who'd been gone for 3 decades. It led to their first serious argument in years, Marcus insisting he had a responsibility and Sarah insisting his first responsibility was to his living family. In the end, they reached a compromise. Marcus would consult and support the mission, but he wouldn't be part of the team that entered the tunnel. The mission took 2 years to organize. Permits had to be obtained, funding secured, safety protocols developed. A small access shaft was drilled into the mountain, reaching the original tunnel without disturbing the concrete that sealed it. Specialized equipment was lowered into the shaft, instruments that could monitor the quantum signatures and potentially stabilize them enough to allow safe passage. The team that would enter the tunnel consisted of 6 people. 3 physicists, a medical doctor, a parapsychologist, and a specialist in quantum computing. They were all volunteers, all fully briefed on the risks, all accepting that they might not come back. Marcus met with each of them, shared his experiences, warned them about what they might encounter. They listened with a mixture of fear and determination, scientists and specialists driven by the need to understand, to push the boundaries of human knowledge even at great personal risk. The mission was scheduled for October 15th, 32 years to the day after the original incident. It seemed fitting, a closing of the circle, an attempt to answer questions that had been asked for more than 3 decades. Marcus was there at the access site, along with Dr. Vasquez, city officials, and family members of the disappeared who wanted to be present for whatever happened. The team entered the tunnel through the access shaft at noon, descending on cables into the darkness that had been sealed away for so many years. They were in constant radio contact, describing what they saw. The original tunnel preserved exactly as it had been, dust covering everything, the buses and cars that had been trapped inside when the tunnel was sealed still sitting where they'd been abandoned. And underlying everything, a sense of wrongness, a feeling that the space wasn't entirely part of normal reality. For the first hour, nothing unusual happened. The team set up their equipment, took measurements, documented everything they found. The quantum signatures Dr. Vasquez had detected were even stronger inside the tunnel, suggesting that the barrier between realities was thinner here than anywhere they'd previously measured. It was like standing at the edge of an abyss, looking down into something vast and incomprehensible. Then, in the second hour, the fog began to appear. Started slowly, just a hint of mist, but it thickened rapidly. The team had expected this, had prepared for it, but experiencing it directly was something else entirely. Their voices over the radio became tense, frightened, as the fog surrounded them. The static sound began, building in intensity, and beneath it those voices, those impossible voices speaking in languages that existed just outside human understanding. Dr. Vasquez, monitoring from outside, watched the data from the team's instruments spike dramatically. The quantum entanglement was intensifying, the barrier between realities growing even thinner. She made a decision, ordered the team to activate the stabilization equipment they'd brought, devices that theoretically could reinforce the barrier and prevent displacement events. The equipment activated with a hum that could be heard even over the radio static. The team reported that the fog seemed to react to it, pulling back slightly, swirling in patterns that suggested intelligence or at least purposeful movement. And then, something happened that no one had predicted. Through the fog, shapes appeared. Human shapes. The disappeared passengers or something that looked like them, emerging from wherever they'd been for 32 years. The team's cameras captured it all, transmitted the footage in real time to the monitoring station outside. Marcus watched the screens with tears streaming down his face as he saw the 17 people from his bus step out of the fog. They looked exactly as they had 32 years ago, hadn't aged a day, wore the same clothes they disappeared in. They moved slowly, uncertainly, like people waking from a long dream. But something was wrong. Marcus could see it even through the grainy camera feed. The passengers moved too smoothly. Their faces were too blank. Their eyes reflected the camera lights in a way that human eyes shouldn't. These weren't his passengers, not really. They were copies, echoes, something that had taken on their form but wasn't truly them. The quantum entanglement had created simulacra, pulling through information about the disappeared and reconstructing them in this reality. But without their essential selves, without whatever made them truly human. The team inside the tunnel realized this too. The parapsychologist was speaking rapidly into her radio, explaining that what they were seeing wasn't a rescue but a reflection, that the real passengers were still on the other side, in whatever reality they'd been pulled into. These were just shadows, imprints left behind when the original passengers had been displaced, now made physical by the quantum stabilization equipment. Then the shadows turned toward the team, moved toward them, reached out with hands that looked human but felt wrong in a fundamental way. The team backed away, toward the access shaft that was their only exit. Dr. Vasquez was shouting orders through the radio, telling them to shut down the stabilization equipment, to evacuate immediately, but the static was growing louder, drowning out her voice. One of the physicists made a fatal mistake. He reached out to touch one of the shadow figures, perhaps driven by scientific curiosity or perhaps unable to resist the pull of something that looked so human but wasn't. The moment his hand made contact, he screamed, a sound of such pure agony that it cut through even the static. His body convulsed, and Marcus watched in horror as the physicist's form began to shimmer, to become translucent, to fade in the same way the passengers had faded 32 years ago. The other team members grabbed him, tried to pull him back, but it was too late. He dissolved into the fog, becoming one with it, and the shadow figure he'd touched solidified slightly, became more real, more substantial. Marcus understood then with terrible clarity what was happening. The shadows needed energy, needed life force, needed human consciousness to become fully real. They were trying to cross over, to replace the people they resembled, to take their place in this reality. The remaining 5 team members ran for the access shaft, scrambling over equipment, pushing past the shadow figures that reached for them with those wrong hands. 2 more didn't make it. The medical doctor was grabbed from behind, pulled into the fog with barely a sound. The quantum computing specialist tripped over a cable, fell hard, and before he could get up, the shadows were on him, surrounding him, absorbing him. 3 people made it to the access shaft. The 2 remaining physicists and the parapsychologist. They clipped themselves to the cables and signaled to be pulled up. Marcus watched the monitors as they ascended, the fog swirling beneath them, shadow figures looking up with faces that were almost but not quite human. The static on the radio was deafening now, and beneath it, those voices were chanting something, a rhythm that felt ancient and terrible and utterly alien. The 3 survivors emerged from the access shaft in a state of shock, barely able to speak, their eyes wide with what they'd witnessed. The parapsychologist kept repeating one phrase over and over. They want to come through. They want to replace us. They want to be us. Medical teams rushed to care for them while Dr. Vasquez and her colleagues frantically analyzed the data from the equipment that was still running in the tunnel below. What they found was disturbing beyond measure. The quantum signatures had changed during the encounter. The barrier between realities hadn't just thinned, it had been damaged further. The shadow figure's attempt to cross over, combined with the stabilization equipment's interference, had created a larger breach. Whatever existed on the other side now had a better pathway into this reality, and the data suggested that pathway was growing, spreading, becoming more stable. Marcus looked at the monitors showing the tunnel interior. The fog had dissipated, the shadow figures had retreated, but something had changed. The tunnel itself looked different somehow, the walls seeming to shift and flow when viewed through the cameras, the lighting behaving strangely, casting shadows that moved independently of their sources. The tunnel was no longer just a place where displacement events could occur. It was becoming something else, a permanent bridge between realities, a doorway that was slowly opening. Dr. Vasquez made an immediate decision. The access shaft needed to be sealed, the tunnel needed to be completely isolated from any human contact. More than that, they needed to find a way to close the breach, to repair the barrier between realities before whatever was on the other side found a way to come through completely. She contacted government agencies, explained the situation, demanded resources and authority to deal with a threat that most people couldn't even begin to comprehend. The response was swift and decisive. Within hours, military units had secured the area around the sealed tunnel. The access shaft was filled with concrete, then covered with steel plates, then buried under tons of rock. Sensors were installed throughout the mountain, monitoring for any sign of the quantum anomalies spreading beyond the tunnel's location. And a research facility was built nearby, staffed 24 hours a day with scientists and specialists whose job was to find a way to close the breach permanently. Marcus was asked to stay involved as a consultant, but he refused. He'd seen enough, witnessed enough, lost enough. The 3 team members who died in the tunnel brought the total number of disappeared to 30 people who'd been taken or transformed or absorbed by something that shouldn't exist. Marcus couldn't bear to be part of anything that might add to that count. He needed to go home, to his wife and daughter, to the life he'd built in the 32 years since that terrible night when 17 people had vanished from his bus. But before he left, Marcus had one final conversation with Dr. Vasquez. He asked her directly, could the disappeared ever be brought back? Could the 17 passengers from his bus, the family of 4, the 6 scientists from the first research team, and the 3 who'd just been taken, could any of them be rescued or were they lost forever? Dr. Vasquez was quiet for a long time before answering. Then she told Marcus the truth as she understood it. The displaced people weren't dead in any conventional sense. Their quantum signatures still existed, still resonated across the dimensional barrier. But they weren't really alive either, at least not in a way that had meaning in human terms. They'd been transformed, absorbed into whatever existed on the other side, their consciousness and memories and identities becoming part of something vast and incomprehensible. The shadow figures the team had encountered weren't the disappeared people trying to return. They were something else using the information from the disappeared to create copies, imperfect reconstructions that looked human but lacked whatever essential quality made a person truly themselves. Bringing back the actual disappeared people would require crossing over to the other side, finding them in whatever form they now existed, and pulling them back across a barrier that was never meant to be crossed. It was theoretically possible, Dr. Vasquez said, but the risks were immeasurable. Anyone who crossed over might not be able to return, might become displaced themselves, might end up feeding whatever existed on the other side and making it stronger. And even if someone did manage to bring back the displaced, there was no guarantee they'd still be human in any meaningful sense. They might be changed, transformed, carrying something of the other side back with them that could spread and infect this reality. Marcus listened to all of this and felt a crushing weight of finality. His 17 passengers were gone, truly and permanently gone. He would never know what had happened to them after they disappeared into. The fog would never be able to give their families the closure they desperately needed, would never be able to absolve himself of the guilt he carried for surviving when they hadn't. He thanked Dr. Vasquez for her honesty, wished her luck with her research, and drove home through normal streets in the normal world, trying to reconcile the ordinary reality around him with the impossible truth he now carried. The universe was stranger and more dangerous than most people could imagine. There were places where the rules broke down, where other realities pressed close to ours, where human beings could be erased from existence or transformed into something utterly alien. When Marcus arrived home, Sarah was waiting for him. She'd been watching the news, had seen the reports about the failed rescue mission, the 3 more people lost to the tunnel. She didn't ask him for details, just held him while he cried. The first time he'd really allowed himself to grieve for all the people who'd been lost, all the lives destroyed by something that shouldn't exist. Hope, their daughter, now 12 years old, came home from school to find her father in a state she'd rarely seen. Marcus tried to compose himself, tried to be strong for her, but she was old enough to understand that something terrible had happened. She sat with him, held his hand in her smaller one, and asked him the question that had haunted him for more than 3 decades. "Dad, do you think the people who disappeared are in a better place?" Marcus thought about the shadow figures, about the fog that hunted and consumed, about the alien voices speaking in languages that predated human existence. He thought about quantum barriers and dimensional breaches and consciousness absorbed into something vast and incomprehensible. And then he looked at his daughter's hopeful face and made a choice. "Yes," he said, "I think they're somewhere different, somewhere we can't understand, but I hope they're at peace. I hope they're together. I hope they don't remember being afraid." It was a lie, or maybe it was hope, or maybe it was the only truth that mattered when faced with something so far beyond human experience that honest answers became meaningless. Hope seemed satisfied with this response, hugged her father, and went to do her homework, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts and his grief and his memories. The weeks that followed were difficult. Marcus had nightmares, vivid dreams where he was back in the tunnel, back behind the wheel of bus 847, watching his passengers disappear one by one, while he drove helplessly through fog that pressed against the windows like hungry hands. He'd wake up gasping, his heart pounding, and Sarah would hold him until the terror passed and the normal world reasserted itself. He attended therapy, talked to counselors who specialized in trauma, tried cognitive behavioral techniques and meditation and every other coping mechanism that might help him process what he'd experienced. Some of it helped, some of it didn't, but gradually the nightmares became less frequent and the daytime anxiety became more manageable. News about the tunnel situation was heavily controlled by the government. Official statements claimed the research mission had been aborted due to safety concerns, that the 3 scientists who died had been victims of a structural collapse in the unstable sealed tunnel, that there was no ongoing threat to public safety. Most people believed these explanations or simply lost interest as newer stories dominated the news cycle. But there were those who didn't believe, who suspected the truth was more complicated and more disturbing. Conspiracy theorists seized on inconsistencies in the official story, pointed out discrepancies between eyewitness accounts and government statements, demanded answers that would never be provided. Online forums filled with speculation about what really existed in the Mount Harrison tunnel, theories ranging from alien bases to government experiments to portals to hell. Marcus watched all of this from a distance, neither confirming nor denying the various theories, simply staying silent and hoping the attention would eventually move elsewhere. He'd told his story, had warned people about the dangers, had done everything he could. The rest was out of his hands. 6 months after the failed rescue mission, Marcus received a letter from one of the survivors, the parapsychologist who'd been part of the team that entered the tunnel. Her name was Dr. Jennifer Chun, and she wrote that she was struggling with what she'd witnessed, having trouble reconciling her experience with any framework of understanding she'd previously possessed. She wanted to talk with Marcus, thought maybe someone else who'd survived an encounter with the phenomenon might help her process what she'd been through. They met at a quiet restaurant, 2 survivors of the impossible trying to make sense of their shared trauma. Dr. Chun looked haunted, her eyes carrying the same weight Marcus saw in his own reflection. She told him about the shadow figures in detail, about how they'd moved and reached and tried to touch the team. She described the feeling of wrongness that had emanated from them, the sense that they were something wearing human shape but lacking any human quality underneath the surface. Most disturbing, Dr. Chan said she'd been having dreams since the incident. Dreams where she was on the other side of the barrier, in the reality where the displaced people had been taken. She described a place that wasn't really a place, a space that existed outside normal physics, where consciousness flowed like liquid and identities merged and separated like clouds. She saw the displaced people there, or what remained of them, fragments of memory and personality drifting in an ocean of alien awareness. In her dreams, Dr. Chun said, the displaced were aware of her. They recognized her as someone from their original reality, and they tried to communicate, to send messages back through her consciousness. But their thoughts were no longer fully human, had been changed by their time in that other space, and what they wanted to convey was terrifying. They were trying to warn her. They were trying to tell her that the breach wasn't an accident, that something on the other side had deliberately created it, had been working for years or maybe centuries to create pathways into human reality. The Mount Harrison Tunnel wasn't the only location where the barrier was thin. There were dozens, maybe hundreds of places around the world where similar phenomena had occurred or might occur in the future. And with each displacement event, with each person pulled through to the other side, the barrier weakened further. Whatever existed on the other side was patient and methodical, slowly working toward a moment when the barrier would fail completely and the two realities would merge. Marcus listened to all of this with growing horror. If Dr. Chun was right, if her dreams were more than just trauma-induced nightmares, then the disappearances weren't random tragedies. They were part of something planned, something purposeful, something working toward an end that Marcus couldn't even begin to imagine. And the 30 people who'd disappeared from the tunnel, his 17 passengers among them, weren't victims of circumstance. They were sacrifices, fuel for something vast and patient and utterly inhuman. He asked Dr. Chun if she'd told anyone else about her dreams. If Dr. Vasquez and her team knew about this potential interpretation. Dr. Chun shook her head. She'd been afraid to share it, afraid she'd be dismissed as traumatized and delusional, afraid that even if people believed her, there was nothing they could do about a threat of this magnitude. But she'd needed to tell someone, needed Marcus to know because he was the only other person who might understand. Marcus didn't know what to do with this information. If Dr. Chen's dreams were accurate, if they represented genuine communication from the displaced rather than just psychological trauma, then humanity was facing a threat that couldn't be fought with conventional means. You couldn't seal off or destroy every location where the barrier was thin. You couldn't prevent displacement events without understanding their fundamental cause. And you certainly couldn't stop something that operated across dimensional boundaries using patience measured in centuries or millennia. But Marcus also knew that fear and helplessness were exactly what would allow something like this to succeed. If there was even a chance that Dr. Chen's dreams contained useful information, then that information needed to be shared with people who might be able to act on it. He convinced her to meet with Dr. Vasquez, to share everything she'd experienced and dreamed, to risk being dismissed as delusional in the hope that someone might take the warning seriously. Dr. Vasquez did take it seriously. She'd been studying the quantum signatures from the tunnel and had found anomalies that suggested purposeful manipulation rather than random dimensional instability. The patterns in the data were too regular, too precisely timed, to be natural phenomena. Something was indeed creating these breaches deliberately, and Dr. Chen's dreams, however they originated, matched what the data was suggesting. A task force was assembled, drawing on resources from multiple governments and scientific institutions. Their mandate was to identify all locations where dimensional barriers might be thin, to monitor them for signs of displacement events, and to develop countermeasures that might prevent or reverse the breach process. It was an enormous undertaking, complicated by the fact that most governments still didn't officially acknowledge that displacement phenomena existed. Marcus was asked to join the task force as a consultant and survivor advocate. This time he agreed, understanding that his personal peace was less important than the potential threat to all of humanity. If something was working to merge realities, to bring whatever existed on the other side into contact with human civilization, then every resource and every person with relevant knowledge needed to be mobilized. The work was exhausting and often frustrating. Progress was slow, breakthroughs were rare, and for every question they answered, 3 more emerged. But gradually, piece by piece, a picture began to form. The entity or entities on the other side, whatever they were, seemed to feed on consciousness, on the complex patterns of thought and memory and identity that made humans individuals. Each displaced person provided nourishment and energy, allowing the other side entities to grow stronger, to push harder against the dimensional barrier. But the displacement wasn't one-directional. Just as humans were being pulled through to the other side, something was trying to come through in the opposite direction. The shadow figures Dr. Chen's team had encountered weren't copies or echoes. They were the other side entities attempting to clothe themselves in human form, using information absorbed from the displaced to construct bodies and identities that could exist in human reality. If even one of these entities managed to fully cross over, to successfully mimic a human being well enough to pass undetected, it could potentially open the door for others. The task force developed screening protocols, tests that might identify beings that looked human but weren't, based on subtle discrepancies in quantum signatures and electromagnetic patterns. The protocols were imperfect, but they were better than nothing. Years passed in this strange new reality, where Marcus balanced his normal life with his work on the task force, where Sarah supported him while worrying about the toll this took on his health and sanity, where hope grew into a young woman who understood that her father carried knowledge that weighed on him like a physical burden. They were as normal a family as they could be, given the circumstances, finding joy in small moments while knowing that larger threats loomed in the background. The Mount Harrison tunnel remained sealed and monitored, the quantum breach showing no signs of healing but also not growing larger. It existed in a state of stasis, a wound in reality that neither closed nor spread, maintained in that state by constant surveillance and intervention from Dr. Vasquez's team. Similar sites around the world received similar treatment, a global network of monitored thin places where the barrier between realities remained dangerously fragile. Marcus turned 70, retired from his technical writing career, spent more time with his family and less time traveling to task force meetings and research facilities. He'd given decades of his life to understanding and fighting the threat that had taken his 17 passengers, and while the threat hadn't been defeated, it had at least been contained. The next generation of researchers and specialists would have to continue the work, would have to maintain vigilance against something that might not show its full intentions for generations to come. On a quiet evening 40 years after that night in the tunnel, Marcus sat on his porch watching another sunset, his wife beside him, his daughter visiting with grandchildren who would never know the full story of what their grandfather had witnessed and survived. The world had moved on, had found new crises and new threats to worry about, had mostly forgotten about the mysterious disappearances in a tunnel that was now buried under so much concrete and steel that it might as well never have existed. But Marcus remembered. He remembered every face of every passenger on bus 847, remembered their names and where they'd been going and the small details that made them individual human beings rather than just statistics in an unexplained phenomenon. He remembered the fog and the static and the terrible moment when he'd understood that something impossible was taking his passengers one by one while he could only watch and drive and survive. He thought about Dr. Chen's dreams, about the displaced existing in some form beyond human understanding, fragments of consciousness drifting in an alien ocean. He hoped they weren't suffering, hoped that whatever they'd become didn't include the capacity for fear or pain or longing for the lives they'd lost. It was cold comfort, but it was the only comfort available when dealing with something so far beyond human experience that conventional notions of life and death became meaningless. The sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded Marcus of the tunnel's sodium vapor lights. Sarah squeezed his hand, understanding without words what he was thinking about, what he was always thinking about on evenings when the light reminded him of that night. They sat together in comfortable silence, two old people who'd built a life despite witnessing the impossible, who'd found peace despite knowing that beneath the surface of reality, terrible things lurked and waited. Marcus closed his eyes and sent a silent message to his 17 passengers, wherever they were, whatever they'd become. He told them he was sorry for surviving when they hadn't. He told them he'd tried his best to understand what had happened to them, to warn others, to prevent it from happening again. He told them they hadn't been forgotten, that their names were engraved on a memorial, that family members still spoke about them and mourned them and wondered what had become of them. And maybe, somewhere in that alien ocean beyond the dimensional barrier, fragments of consciousness that had once been his passengers received that message. Maybe some echo of their human selves still existed, still remembered being on a bus at night, driving through a tunnel that had become the last place they'd existed as fully human beings. Maybe they understood that Marcus had done what he could, had survived carrying their memory, had spent 40 years of his life trying to make sense of the senseless and prevent others from suffering the same fate. Or maybe they were truly gone, absorbed so completely into the other side that nothing remained of who they'd been. Maybe consciousness didn't survive displacement after all. Maybe what Dr. Chun had dreamed and what the quantum data suggested was just human need for meaning, for pattern, for explanation, imposed on something that was fundamentally beyond explanation. Marcus would never know for certain. That uncertainty would be his burden to carry for whatever time he had left. His price for being the one who survived, the one who bore witness, the one who tried to protect others from a threat that most people didn't believe existed. It wasn't a burden he would have chosen, but it was the one he'd been given, and he'd carried it as well as he could. The sky darkened, stars appearing one by one, familiar constellations that had looked down on humanity since the beginning. Marcus found that comforting somehow, the knowledge that despite all the strangeness and terror and impossible things he'd witnessed, the universe continued its ancient rhythms, indifferent to human fears and human suffering, simply existing in all its vast and incomprehensible majesty. Inside the house, his grandchildren were laughing about something, their voices bright with innocence and joy. Hope called out that dinner was ready, that everyone should come inside. Sarah stood, held out her hand to help Marcus up from his chair, smiled at him with a mixture of love and concern that she'd perfected over their decades together. Marcus took her hand, stood with the stiffness of age, and walked inside toward warmth and light and the sound of family. Behind him, the night deepened, stars shining down on a world that was stranger than most people knew, more dangerous than most people could accept, but also more resilient than anything that threatened it. Humanity would survive, would continue, would find ways to adapt and endure even when faced with threats from beyond the boundaries of normal reality. And somewhere in the heart of Mount Harrison, sealed behind concrete and steel and layers of monitoring equipment, a tunnel existed that was no longer quite part of this world. The fog waited there, patient and eternal, the barrier between realities remaining thin, the breach neither healing nor growing. It was a wound that wouldn't close, a doorway that wouldn't quite open, a place where two realms touched but didn't merge, held in balance by human vigilance and human determination and the simple refusal to surrender to the impossible. The bus had entered the tunnel empty and emerged with 17 people gone. That was the simple truth, the surface reality that everyone could see and understand. But beneath that truth lay something far more complex and disturbing, a web of dimensional physics and alien consciousness and patient malevolence that Marcus had spent 40 years trying to unravel. He'd succeeded partially, failed partially, and learned to live with the ambiguity that came with confronting mysteries that might never be fully solved. As Marcus sat down to dinner with his family, as Hope served food and his grandchildren chattered about school and friends and the small dramas of their young lives, he allowed himself to set down the burden for a moment. Not forever, never forever, but for this evening, in this house, with these people he loved, Marcus could be just a grandfather, just a husband, just a man eating dinner and enjoying the simple pleasures of life. The tunnel would still be there tomorrow. The threat would still exist. The disappeared would still be gone, their fate uncertain, their memory preserved in stone and in the hearts of those who'd known them. But tonight Marcus was home, was safe, was surrounded by love and life and the ordinary magic of human connection. And that, in the end, was the real victory against the fog and the darkness and the impossible. Not understanding it, not defeating it, but simply refusing to let it destroy the capacity for joy and love and hope that made life worth living despite all the mysteries and terrors the universe contained. If you've stayed with us through this entire story, thank you for listening. The tale of Marcus Chen and the Mount Harrison Tunnel reminds us that reality is stranger than we imagine, that there are places in our world where the rules we rely on might not apply, and that the greatest courage often lies not in heroic action but in simply continuing to live, to love, and to hope despite witnessing things that should be impossible. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more mysteries, more unexplained phenomena, and more tales of ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances, make sure to subscribe to Real Conflict Zone. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode. And please, write down your suggestions in the comment box. What kind of stories do you want to hear? What mysteries intrigue you? What unexplained phenomena keep you awake at night wondering? Your input helps us create the content you want to experience. Until next time, stay curious, stay cautious, And remember that the world is full of wonders and terrors in equal measure. Take care, and we'll see you in the next story. Goodbye.